A dark sun. At midday across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, daylight dimmed to a dusky glow that lingered for months. This unsettling phenomenon, described by contemporary writers as a sun without brightness, was the result of a stratospheric aerosol veil, a massive cloud of particles blasted high into the atmosphere by a powerful volcanic eruption. When a volcano spews huge amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, it converts into sulfate particles that spread globally, scattering sunlight back into space. This reduces the amount of solar radiation that reaches the ground, lowering surface temperatures and muting daylight. Unlike ordinary smoke or fog, which quickly dissipates, these stratospheric sulfates can persist for a year or more, sitting above weather systems. Multiple lines of evidence point to the year 536 as the start of this cataclysmic event. Ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica show a sharp spike in sulfate levels that year, while tree rings reveal severely reduced growth, indicating a sudden and profound climate shock. The most likely cause was a high-latitude northern hemisphere eruption that quickly blanketed the hemisphere in a suffocating haze. Harvests fail. With sunlight muted and temperatures plummeting, agricultural systems across the northern hemisphere collapsed. Written records from Byzantium, Ireland, and China describe harvests ruined by cold summers and abnormal frosts. In Ireland, annals recount a failure of bread that lasted for 3 consecutive years. Wheat, barley, and millet, the foundational crops of Eurasian diets, rely on reliable growing seasons, but in 536 those seasons were dramatically shortened. Average summer temperatures fell by as much as 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, a drop significant enough to prevent crops from ripening. Archaeological studies of charred grain deposits in Europe show a decline in the size and quality of harvests, while pollen records confirm that many fields were abandoned. This agricultural collapse swiftly led to widespread famine. In Constantinople, grain prices skyrocketed as supplies dwindled despite imperial reserves. In China, official histories recorded frost-killing crops during the summer, a clear sign of the extreme and unseasonable cold. This synchronized agricultural failure across distant regions demonstrates how a single climatic shock radiated immediate hardship worldwide, devastating the food sources that sustained early medieval societies. Starvation, collapse. The widespread agricultural failure of 536 did not just lead to hunger, it triggered mass starvation and immense social strain. Chroniclers in Ireland wrote of a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539, highlighting a prolonged period of hunger. In Scandinavia, archaeological surveys indicate abandoned villages and mass migrations as communities dispersed or fled south in a desperate search for food. Historical demography suggests population losses of 25 to 50% in some of the hardest-hit areas. In China's Northern Wei dynasty, severe famine fueled civil unrest and a sharp population decline, with accounts of entire provinces facing critical food shortages. Evidence of nutritional stress also appears in human skeletal remains, showing stunted growth and higher mortality rates. These famines destabilized political structures. Ruling elites lost their tax bases, armies shrank, and weakened states became susceptible to invasions and rebellion. The interconnected nature of early medieval economies meant that famine in one region could cascade outward, disrupting trade and intensifying collapse across borders. The breakdown of reliable food supplies and the ensuing social chaos created the perfect storm for instability on a global scale. Eyewitnesses. While modern science has pieced together the physical evidence, contemporary observers struggled to explain the strange weather and dim skies of 536. Their accounts, however, provide invaluable first-hand details for modern historians. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during the whole year. This wasn't an isolated observation. Similar reports appeared in Ireland, Italy, and China. The Syriac Chronicle of Zuknin noted that the sun was dark and its darkness lasted 18 months. In China, official histories recorded that yellow dust fell like snow and crops failed under cold, dim skies. These ancient texts, written long before the advent of modern atmospheric science, align remarkably well with the volcanic aerosol theory. They show that people across vast and unconnected regions noticed the same atmospheric anomaly, confirming a global cause rather than local dust storms or fires. By piecing together these independent testimonies, historians can reconstruct a coherent and compelling image of a world plunged into a profound and unsettling atmospheric haze. Nature's record. Beyond human testimony, physical records in nature itself confirm that 536 was a year of extreme cold. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, shows a sharp reduction in annual growth starting in 536 across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Narrower rings indicate poor growing conditions, typically caused by cold temperatures or drought. The rings from this period are so thin that scientists have identified 536 as a standout anomaly in the last 2,500 years. Even more compelling is the evidence from ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica. These frozen archives contain chemical traces of volcanic sulfate deposited precisely in that year. The cores reveal not just one eruption, but a cluster of massive volcanic events between 536 and 540, which amplified the cooling effect. This combined impact created a sudden, prolonged volcanic winter with temperature drops that lasted for several years. Together, these natural archives provide independent, irrefutable proof that the strange weather of 536 was truly a global and extreme event. The Plague. Only a few years after the climate shock of 536, the Byzantine Empire was struck by the Justinianic Plague, beginning in 541. This pandemic, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same one responsible for the later Black Death, spread rapidly through trade routes that had already been weakened by famine and instability. Constantinople, the imperial capital, was devastated, with estimates suggesting that up to half the city's population died in a single outbreak. Chroniclers described corpses stacked in the streets and ships adrift with dead crews. The timing of this pandemic suggests that populations, already malnourished from years of crop failure, were especially vulnerable to disease, making the outbreak far deadlier. Genetic studies of ancient plague victims confirm the presence of Y. pestis, connecting historical accounts with biological evidence. The Justinianic plague would recur in waves for over 2 centuries, compounding the demographic and political crises that had been set in motion by the disaster of 536. Trade collapse. The environmental shocks of 536 directly undermined economies that were built on agriculture and long-distance trade. In the Byzantine Empire, tax revenues plummeted as farmland yields collapsed, straining state finances and limiting military campaigns. Grain shortages destabilized markets across the Mediterranean, driving inflation as food prices soared. In Northern Europe, archaeological finds show a dramatic decline in coinage circulation during the late 530s, indicating weakened commerce and disrupted exchange systems. Long-distance trade routes also suffered. The Silk Road, which linked China, Central Asia, and Byzantium, faced interruptions as famines in key regions reduced the surplus goods available for export. Maritime trade in the Red Sea and Mediterranean slowed as ports were hit by shortages and unrest. This economic contraction deepened social divisions. Elites desperately tried to secure resources while peasants bore the heaviest burden of scarcity. The collapse of reliable trade and taxation systems eroded the foundations of several early medieval states, leaving them vulnerable to future shocks. Political shifts. The combined crises of famine, disease, and economic collapse destabilized kingdoms and empires throughout the 6th century. In Scandinavia, archaeological evidence suggests a widespread abandonment of farms, which led to migrations that reshaped regional power structures. The Byzantine Empire, already strained by war, saw its armies shrink as famine and plague reduced manpower, forcing difficult strategic choices. In China, the Northern Wei dynasty fractured under the pressure of crop failures and famines, splitting into Eastern and Western Wei and descending into internal conflict. These upheavals were not isolated events. They were reflections of how a sudden climatic downturn exposed the fragility of political systems that relied on steady harvests and trade. As instability spread, weakened governments lost legitimacy, paving the way for new rulers, migrations, and shifting borders that would define the centuries following 536. A cascade. The catastrophe of 536 wasn't a single event, but the first in a cluster of volcanic eruptions that extended the crisis for years. Ice core records show one major eruption in 536, followed by another in 540, likely originating in Central America or Indonesia. Each eruption injected massive amounts of sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere, renewing the global haze and prolonging the cooling. The second eruption compounded the agricultural collapse already underway, ensuring that recovery was delayed well into the mid-500s. Climate models based on these eruptions estimate global temperature drops of up to 2.5 degrees Celsius, enough to shorten growing seasons for nearly a decade. This rare sequence of back-to-back large-scale eruptions created one of the most severe and sustained volcanic winters in recorded history, anchoring the period's worldwide hardship. Cultural impact. As humanity grappled with these events, people across different civilizations sought meaning in the extreme environmental and social upheavals. Many viewed the darkened sun, failed crops, and disease as signs of divine punishment or ominous omens. In Byzantium, chroniclers interpreted the events as signs of the apocalypse, linking famine and plague to moral and spiritual failings. In China, court historians attributed the crop failures and unusual weather to the displeasure of heaven, emphasizing the emperor's responsibility to maintain cosmic harmony. Similar interpretations appeared in Irish annals, which connected widespread famine to supernatural causes. These cultural responses influenced governance and decision-making. Rulers attempted ritual appeasements, religious authorities gained prominence by claiming insight into divine will, and communities reinforced moral codes as a form of social control. The events of 536 demonstrate how environmental crises can profoundly shape cultural and religious thought, leaving an indelible mark on collective memory and historical record. The disasters of 536 AD weakened populations, setting the stage for the Black Death. This pandemic spread rapidly, killing millions across the Byzantine Empire and beyond. To see how it unfolded and reshaped the ancient world, watch our next video.